We want to start by a few reflections from the discussions that we had yesterday. I hope we have all had a great breakfast, including Jeremy. I didn't say anything about cigarettes, I said breakfast. So we just want to begin by reflecting on yesterday. So I will be asking colleagues to make some reflections on what they think they picked from yesterday. From me, quite a number of issues, I think, came out from yesterday. We asked some very, very deep questions. Most impactful were the reflections that came from Mama Grace Michelle. She asked the question, how did we get to this? How did we get to this? What is it that we did not do right? What is it that we did not do right? She reflected on the question of leadership in terms of us just having to look up to certain leaders. But I think a powerful concept came out from her reflections, leading through people. And she said, we are the people, we have to take responsibility. She said, if we look at the quality of the leadership today and just wait upon them, we will be paralyzed. We are currently suffering from paralysis. So you look at these tragedies that we are talking about, and you say, why are they not doing something? So if everyone is saying, why are they not doing something? Then we become paralyzed. So she said, sovereignty resides in the people. We had quite some powerful concepts that came from the panels that we had yesterday. The concept of active, conscious citizens to stand for the principles of freedom. I heard about the quality of leadership depending on the quality of citizenry. I also heard about laws passing through Parliament at the speed of unidentified flying objects rather than being passed by Parliament. I heard about the cost of elections and the use of democratic institutions to entrench authoritarianism. So I want to get to the house to get some reflections. I hope there is a roving mic somewhere for those who are seated where there are no mics. But I want to invite any reflections from yesterday's sessions from the room. Yes, Jeremy.
Good morning, all, and Zekamai. I hope you'll allow me to make a reflection on an issue that I think we did not address, which I'd just like to flag. It cropped up tangentially towards the end of the day, but I think it's an important part of the agenda, and I would really just like to put it in front of you, and that is the role of the military and the security sector in terms of our discussions. And I want to make 3 quick points about that, picking up on comments that were made by Hopewell and Timothy Mariti. The first is the role of the military, of the securocrats, and of the security sector, both in its narrow definition and its broader definition in terms of the road ahead for democracy. What role does the security sector play in democratization or obstacles towards democratization? I think is a very important issue to at least flag here so that it's reflected in your report. I won't go into it, you're all familiar with it, and those of us from Zimbabwe have our direct experience But it's noticeable that despite the fact that there are fewer coups in Africa today than there were 2 or 3 decades ago, there are a larger number of governance institutions and governments in Africa that are dependent on military and security support. That's my first point. So I think it's a very important issue to flag and possibly to be addressed in future discussions. There won't be space, obviously, today in our agenda to address it, but I do think it's important to take note of it. The second is specifically related to the question of the failure to transform inherited colonial institutional structure, political structure, and governance structure. And nowhere is that more obvious and more worrying than in the security sector, where the failure to transform our security policies and doctrine, and in particular to shift the focus away from its state-centric colonial inheritance towards a more citizen and human security-focused approach, and to bring these two into balance. This speaks directly to the democratization process. Human security policies in our governments are directly related to the democratic transformation process. And so our failure to transform these security institutions to allow citizen security-focused policies to create space for them is one of the big impediments towards democratization and the process of democracy. And that's my second point. And my third point is this, which I think is also very important. Over the last 20 years, the number of foreign military bases in Africa has increased by almost 500%. The United States leading the pack now with 52 military bases in the country, but many other countries, including China, France, and others. And the relationship between this foreign military presence and our own military and security apparatus poses a major question and challenge for us. And this is, of course, linked with resource acquisition and resource conflict. But I think we need to pay more attention to what's going on quietly behind the scenes. What is AFRICOM doing? And why does it have a budget that is nearly 4 times larger than the African Union's? So I wanted to just flag these so that they'll go into your report as issues. And actually, Annan, to your institutions, this is a very important subject for us if we're addressing democracy. So forgive me for having ambushed you, but I think it should just be flagged so that we look at this as an important challenge we all face. And thank you very much. That's what I had to reflect.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think Tim made some reflections yesterday about the role of the colonial legacy. And I think the military is one of the institutions which remains, I think, as an obstacle. Yes, Roswitha.
My name is Roswitha. I'm from Zimbabwe. A key reflection for me from yesterday was that how do we close the gap between vision and reality? And I think what was coming out from the conversation is that we have democracy without democracy. We have institutions, we have constitutions, but there is no real democracy within Africa. And I think the key challenge is that how do we work around having strong institutions that safeguard democracy, and how do we work with citizens to be able to reclaim the nations and SADC as a whole?
Thank you very much, Roswitha. Yes, Leonard.
Morning, everybody. I'm Leonard. I'm doing my PhD in the politics department at UCT, and I'm with the Institute of Democracy. And one of the points which I think needs to be discussed more as we go forward, it was mentioned, was the issue of term change abolitions, presidential term limits. Because if you look at scholars like Larry Diamond, Freedom House in, I think their 2016 report has noted that there's a direct correlation between countries experiencing democratic erosion and constitutional term limit abolitions. When you look at I call it there's a ring going from Cameroon down to the Great Lakes, where almost all the countries have experienced constitutional term abolitions. And we've seen that there's been a consistent erosion of the state of their democracy. And I'm afraid that it might seep down into Southern Africa, because I know that Zambia is trying to pull something of that sort. And I think that's something which really needs to be talked about, because, you know, in most of our African political systems, it's very presidentialist. The presidents are at the center. So, you know, they're kept in power. They're able to continue to erode by crafting the rules in a way which best suits them, as well as the regimes which they're in control of.
Thank you very much. I think that speaks also to the issue that was raised yesterday of the emergence of presidential states. Yes.
I'm Jennifer. I've been reflecting, and I think my analogy is I would actually refer to a poem, a nursery rhyme actually, which goes, 3 blind mice. So what I'm trying to say is the electorate blindly follow a party out of a sense of loyalty without introspection. So what I'm thinking is, in a multi-party state like ours, how is it possible for one party to reign for 25 years? It is virtually impossible to break this code, leading to a divine, arrogant structure governing. And to be honest, fatigue has set in, hence the lack of voter incentive, and the narrative is getting very stale. And I think that's what Mama Graca was referring to, and that's why there's a stuckness. Now, how do we get out of this quicksand, this stuckness that is actually dragging the country down? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. There is a president of a Southern African country who actually said the rule that his party has brought to that country, even in heaven, it's not found. It's so good. So that pushes them to rule for that long. Are there any other reflections? All right, we will continue reflecting on this. In the interest of time, one more. Okay. Yes, Matthias. While we wait on someone trying to usurp the powers of the director of ceremonies.
Sure. I think one comment that was at the very end yesterday about corporate, or what corporate citizenship would have to add to this, I think we should think about this more, how it fits in. So whether that means what their relationship is with government during elections, so speaking about big tech companies, companies like Facebook and Google, they don't just have an impact on elections in the global north, but also here. But also, what should their role be when it comes to election disputes? When it comes to critical decisions, should they not be more outspoken? Should we not demand more of them if they're here? So I think that's something where we can pick up on, even in a different conference.
Thank you very much. Are we having a technical problem? We can proceed.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Prof.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Well, I can't help but really reflect very personally about the events of yesterday. I myself was very moved by, firstly, having to step in for the Vice-Chancellor, but also to introduce Mama Graca Machel. It is an interesting time for South Africa, and it's an interesting time for all of you around here, because you are experts on democracy, and our democracy here is going through a very, very testing and challenging time. But I said yesterday I was ashamed of some of the things that were happening in the country. I think this morning I should say that I'm proud of South Africans, because yesterday we saw thousands of students, almost the entire place, and I hope we'll get the clip so you'll get a feel for what was happening here. And I know this because I teach as well, so I'll have a lot of students calling me. And they have been moved by the events in the country, and they have decided to take a stand. The Vice-Chancellor also has displayed remarkable leadership, and she cancelled all lectures and university activities until the end of the week. And I said to you, it's a personal reflection. So my daughter's 13 years old, and her school has decided that this morning they're going to be on the street with placards, and they are going to make a stand. These are high school kids. And so that is the kind of citizenship. That's what brings about change. And so today I'm feeling proud that we are standing up. Our people are standing up. So thank you very much, really, to all of you. I think there were a lot of questions that arose yesterday from the discussion, a very, very rich discussion, one of the richest discussions I've heard for a long time. And it has helped me personally to think and reflect about the situation we find ourselves in this country. And I think that it'll be very helpful if we list those questions, because those are the research questions. The other thing that struck me very much was how interconnected we are in the challenges we face. They're common challenges, and how we need to reflect on these challenges together to make sense of it and share our experiences. So thank you very much, really, for all of you who've really contributed in such an open, robust, and passionate way yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fazo, for your leadership. I want to invite Sebastien and the next panel to come up front. I think the leadership that Professor Fazo talks about is what we usually refer to as leadership with compassion. I have always said that the position of leadership is a sacred office. And unless you have got compassion for the people that we lead, we are not worthy of that sacred office. Yesterday, we did put democracy under the lens. We reflected on the architecture that is supposed to make democracy work. We reflected on the governance systems that are supposed to house democracy. We also did reflect on one of the key components of democracy, the issue of elections. Elections come and go. But in many African places, the legacy of elections is woundedness. And this builds within the infrastructure of violence which controls our elections. As Tim mentioned yesterday, it's a past that we need to process, to interrogate. So while elections come and go, there is beneath and beyond the elections a conversation that should always be happening, because democracy is taking a new form. It is not just about electing leaders for 5 years, and then after that election, they do whatever they please. And for that not to happen, at the base of it, we need to build people leadership. And people leadership comes through the role of civil society. How does civil society contribute perhaps to solving some of the challenges which we talked about yesterday? Because when elections come, we're not just giving our lives to those whom we are electing. We need a continuous and continuing conversation about the things that matter. And to lead us into this reflection, we have been joined here by a powerful panel, which will be facilitated by Sebastien Brack, who is the head of elections and democracy program at the Kofi Annan Foundation. His full bio is in the program, but I thought I should just let you know that Sebastien has worked around the world, and particularly around the continent, in some of the most conflict zones on the continent. He was involved, together with Kofi Annan, in the transition in Nigeria in 2015, with the assistance of the Swiss government, to ensure that there was that peaceful transition. And the foundation, also together with Sebastien, they have worked on a number of election-related issues in trying to accompany states to pass through some of those difficult processes. Help me, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Sebastien and the next panel.
So good morning, everyone. Good morning, my dear panelists, co-panelists. It's the first session of the day, and it's a subject I think is particularly sensitive because many of the people in the room, I believe, are from civil society. So I have to be careful what I say, lest civil society become uncivil towards me if I get too critical. I think that civil society, especially in the discussions we've had over the last 2 days, has been seen as a savior, potential catalyst for political change across the continent, and that is no doubt a good thing. I will start by presenting the topic, then I will present the co-panelists. We'll divide the discussion into 2 parts, the first being the role of civil society in democratic governance, and the second looking at the potential opportunities for collaboration within, but also beyond borders. So I'll divide it into 2 parts, and finally I'll sum up. I invite my co-panelists to try and be brief, and so we can have a conversation, both amongst ourselves, but also with the audience, many of whom have very strong views on this subject, as I'm sure you realize. So, as our MC pointed out, civil society has played a very large role in politics, and this is not new. The role of civil society in democracy has been theorized for a very long time, most famously, I think, by Tocqueville. But I think that civil society, the nature of it, has changed over time. It used to be seen largely, I think, as churches, unions, and now the NGO has been as one of the main proponents of civil society in the last 20 years. And as disappointment, I think, has grown with states, political parties, and traditional politics, huge hopes have been placed within civil society as being one of the main potential sources of hope in the coming years. But we also heard yesterday a number of questions raised about civil society, such as the legitimacy. They often speak on behalf of the people, but they're unelected. There are questions about funding and to what extent that makes them also erodes their credibility. And also the purpose. We have many, many different types of NGOs and civil societies working in different fields. And in fact, here on this table, on this panel, we have a number of different actors, from people working on HIV rights, political rights, NGOs. So that's, I think, the interesting subject. So what extent can civil society fulfill its potential and hopes and address these concerns that people have? But without further ado, let me introduce my fellow co-panelists. I'm going in the order of the program. You can find their full bios in the program, but briefly, Fred Bauma, who is from the DRC and has played a key role, I think, in grassroots mobilization over the past few years. Brian Kagoro from Zimbabwe, who is, I think, a bit of a legend, I believe, in civil society circles in Zimbabwe. Mr. Mark Heywood from South Africa. And we have Mory Conde from Guinea. Je crois que vous êtes le seul francophone parmi nous, donc on remercie d'être là. And Mrs. Bonolo, Ms. Bonolo, did I say that? Sorry, Ms. Bonolo, who's based at Pretoria, but works a lot with the Pan-African Parliament. So to get us started, maybe you can share in a few minutes your perception, your vision of the role of civil society in democratic governance, and if gentlemen don't mind, I think we should let the lady start, have the first go.
Good morning, everyone. Please excuse my voice, I'm recovering from flu. So my contribution to this conversation will be centered around one of the objectives of this panel, which is to identify existing and potential opportunities for collaboration. So actually, I should have been the last person to speak, but it's okay. So I will look at effective civil society engagement with the AU organs, and specifically look at the Pan-African Parliament and explore ways in which civil society could engage effectively with the Pan-African Parliament as the parliament of the continent. And also figure out a way collectively in how we could foster closer collaborations among and within civil society and the Pan-African Parliament.
I realize it's the focus of your NGO's work, but I propose we try and then maybe I'll come back to you then, because I think we should first talk about the role of civil society in democratic governance. That's, I think, the first step, before we talk about how we can work together. But do you have any thoughts on more generally the role that NGOs like yours can play in advancing democratic governance?
I mean, one, I think, so I'll speak briefly on that. Yeah. I think so the civil society particularly has attracted such tremendous attention in political and developmental discourse. And I think it's because there is a recognition that civil society plays a crucial agent in promoting democracy, in promoting good governance and development within the region. So there is a significant role that civil society organization can play in advancing democracy. So one, if I may reflect briefly on roles that particularly our organization is playing in advancing democracy and good governance in Africa. Again, like I said, it's in capacitating member states on drafting reports, capacitating member states on drafting guidelines on human rights and democracy. It's on capacitating members of the Pan-African Parliament specifically on how to advance human rights and democracy in Africa. So there is a particular significant role that I think that civil society can occupy in Africa. And then I will reflect, I do still want to reflect specifically on how civil society can engage effectively with African Union organs, the African Commission, ECOSOC, the Child on Rights, and the Pan-African Parliament.
Okay, thanks, Mandela. Let me turn over to Brian Kagoro, because Brian, I think, was active in traditional party politics at an earlier stage, and he moved then to civil society. And I'm wondering what made him choose to get involved in civil society as a way of impacting democratic governance in Zimbabwe.
I think I will sue Hopewell for misrepresentation. I was in the private sector. And when our country went through our moment, we were representing as lawyers, free of charge or pro bono, people who were being brutalized by the state. They were not just political activists. So that's how we started working with the NGO fraternity. And because of our history in the students' movement and our association with the labor movements and the churches, that's how I started representing the churches and so on. But because I've done work at the continental and global level, I don't want to go into a personal biography. I wanted to suggest to you that perhaps, whilst I appreciate where you want to start on roles, it would be inadequate unless if you start with the question of critique of civil society, of what has been the critique, because the role will answer that. So let me quickly, without wasting your time, just look at three things, because it looks at the disconnect of what might that role be. So if you look generally, the question of impact and efficacy can now be raised, but in the 90s, we were clear we're having impact as civil society because a phenomenal amount of work went into norm making. So a lot of norms, human rights norms, the establishment of certain policies that were progressive. But if you look at what the impact has been on behavior and attitudinal change. So take one, the phenomenal work done by the women's movement and the embedding in constitutions and laws norms against sexual and gender-based violence. And the very fact that we're here today reflecting on the growth of femicide in South Africa, which is meant to have some of the strongest laws, some of the strongest, and that was the achievement of civil society. What happens when what you saw as a goal collapses? So the second one was this very fact that the unintended crowding out. So before rights were the outcome of social struggle, so here the defeat of apartheid was because of what Ambassador Faisal and his generation did in fighting apartheid, and generations before. But what then happened with the moment that we thought was the post-apartheid moment or post-colonial moment is that we reduced the problem to purely that of enforcing norms, because we assumed social struggle had a terminal point. The challenge and the gaps you saw in society, you cure by having good policies and good laws and good institutions, or what in academic we call governmentality, good government. And of course, this has been proven fallen, right? Otherwise, what's happening with the rise of populism in some of the Western democracies is inexplicable. Because if you ask African civil society what we need, we're all saying good laws, good policies, good institutions. America has good laws, good policies, good institutions, but bad leadership. And then the third thing is the crowding out, therefore, of social movements. Those components in social struggle that are more organic, that experience, we almost created a subletting of struggles to a group of experts who could talk the policy language, get into boardrooms, go to WTO, and talk. And the disconnect became fundamental. And then the over-legalization. Lawyers like myself, whilst some people might appreciate the role we've done over the continent, what we essentially did, we reduced the struggle into a technicist legalistic struggle. So each time people were faced with a problem in Zimbabwe, or anywhere else where I've worked, they've come to lawyers. Lawyers will go to court, the court will solve the problem. Therein lies the decapitation of the real role of civil society. And then the other thing is focusing on symptoms, not structural questions. So whether we're talking about femicide, or xenophobia or Afrophobia, and we are shocked by the vile manifestations of much deeper structural problems. And as long as we have a superficial, or I call it a pathologization of this problem, that you think it's a cancer, we can eliminate it, have a demonstration, right? Tweet about it. But it's much more deeper structural issues. But why is there this disconnect? Because I know many colleagues here have many things to say better than I do. The first is civil society became quasi-awkward as far as ideation was concerned. Civil society embraced the great lie of the rise of the liberal moment, ushered in by Margaret Thatcher. I almost said Tina Turner, the Tina. There is no alternative to liberalization. Because we believed ideology had died. So we woke up now with the rise of conservative and right-wing ideology, and suddenly we're scrambling to find some ideological anchor beyond the banal discussion of rights and universal norms, right? The second was intelligence and skills to engage the market and the state. So civil society knows very little except the blunt manifestation of state power. We don't know how militaries work. We don't know how. Nobody quite invests sufficient time to understand. So we become only relevant when we play the victimhood or victimology game, or speak on behalf of victims, right? And then the third, geopolitics and geoeconomics. And this was just not linked to our funding. The fundamental issue is that civil society, save for a few, did not realize the local effect of geopolitics. So this basis that Jeremy was talking about. So we assumed the empire died with the end of apartheid. We assumed there was no other problem. It was indigenous, right? As long as you deal with local autocracy and kleptocracy, we will all live in freedom. We forgot that everybody else has designs that are much broader than ours. And lastly, leadership development. I'm sad to say, sir, that if you look around the room and within most civil society movements, very few can demonstrate the growth of more than 3 generations of new leadership. So the same people who came into civil society with Raftopoulos and myself are still leading some of the same organizations. They've become gatekeepers They've become the establishment alternative to the state establishment. So what they have become is what Ugandans taught me in 1998 is called a civilocracy. An elite of civil society doing gatekeeping in feminism, gatekeeping in trade, gatekeeping and social. So what it essentially means when we are trying to imagine the role of civil society, the next session will deal with the question of youth. We must front and center say, how do alternatives to the neoliberal paradigms that became entrenched as a result of our simplistic thought that local autocracy and kleptocracy was the primary and sole problem? Number two, if we deal with the ideological question, how do we deal with the structural issues? We were told by our funders at the time to organize ourselves like corporates, have a board of highly skilled people that are credible. And essentially, we excluded the semi-literate and non-literate people who were the primary people who experienced this. I could go on, but all I wanted to say, if we want to understand the role of civil society in the moment we're in, look at its disconnect from the youth and millennials. Whether they are millennial jihadists, millennial youth leading revolutions, millennial entrepreneurs, or look at its disconnect from a class perspective with the struggling and popular classes, except for this poverty pornography that we used to do when I was in the UN. When the Secretary General comes, when we're in Kenya, we take him to Kibera. And yet the UN was not investing in Kibera, right? The UN had no significant investment in Kibera, but just a few photo ops with the Secretary General with the suffering people in the slums shows somewhat that the UN cares about poverty. And then sometimes we take a very poor, illiterate person who can't articulate themselves, give them lines to say in front of global media, go to Glen Eagles, get the person to regurgitate, and we say the poor have spoken. So this panel must address this question that we've been complicit in the silencing of the social classes that are most affected by the current neoliberal thrust of development. We've been complicit in the manufacture of the sort of violence, structural violence by both the market and the state. And until we accept our complicitness, we can talk about role in technical terms and wonder until the cows come home while there's a disconnect between popular struggle and ourselves. It was not civil society that led Fees Must Fall. It was not civil society that led in Burkina Faso, right? The exception we're seeing in Sudan, where professional associations, long repressed, begin to arise, is something we must study. Let me rest there for now.
So much to try pulling punches and being civil. I think Brian has given us a very forceful critique of civil society. I think many of his points, you clapped because probably many of his points rung true. But we have here on the panel a counterexample, which I think is very encouraging. Fred Bauma, who is a very young man and has actually mobilized a new generation of activists, maybe not in the traditional neoliberal mold of NGOs, but more grassroots youth movement, and maybe he can share a few experiences of his own and explain how he sees the role of CSOs and in the fight against autocracy and for democracy, and how you respond to Brian's critique.
Thank you, Sebastien. I have to acknowledge that it's very embarrassing to speak after such an eloquent speaker. But I will go from where you ended, saying the complicity between the civil society, the market, and the state. Maybe the good question will be to question ourselves whether or not the civil society did intend to marketize itself, to become part of the market instead of remaining that real civil society. And maybe the other question is to define civil society, and to what I understand is at least the way you are defining it, which is, I think, very common, is to go from those formal structures that speak on behalf of others and define themselves as civil society. And I don't find myself in those kind of structures. Neither LUCHA, the movement I belong to, and many other movements in Africa. You mentioned the Burkina Faso's Ballet Citoyen, or the Yanamar in Senegal, or other group across the continent. And I think, yes, there is a disconnect between these youth movements that are growing up, and the population in general, and the traditional civil society, which, on my point of view, tend to be more driven, more and more, at least towards Concern Congo, more and more driven by the donors, and therefore become part of a sort of NGO market. So, for me, the main problem goes from, so the main role of civil society for me let me go from there, should go from the capacity of those civil society to hold the rulers accountable. And that comes from where the strength of that civil society, where it draw its strength. And for many NGOs, at least many formal NGOs, and we are in a very Anglophone country with many Anglophone, and probably the way we approach the civil society will be very different, but there is this tendency of having a civil society made of experts on gender violence, experts on security reform, experts on this, experts on that, and the large part of our communities, which are undereducated, which doesn't understand the problem in all their complexity, or can't express those problems in those very, very complex concepts, are just let aside. And we don't really give them the opportunity to express themselves and to listen to what they have to say in this environment of marketization of the civil society and expertization of the civil society. And from my experience and the experience of other movements which we work with across the continent, I think the youth movements, the pro-democracy movement, as some people call them, which is more and more considered like a third wave of movement of revendication across the continent, come from that disconnect between the traditional civil society, but also the need to not be represented by the people, by some groups, or some people which doesn't necessarily have the legitimacy to talk in behalf of others. And they need to be less and less dependent on external donors, less and less dependent on structure, and more able to drain masses and to educate more people, so that the future of civil society, at least the definition of civil society, move from structures to the individual persons who understand their role and are able to hold the state accountable. And I think it's kind of changing the way we approach civil society, and we faced so many problems in going in this way. I remember, and maybe I will end by this before coming back. I remember in 2012, when we start, for example, with the LUCHA movement, we faced this very professionalization, the problem of professionalization of civil society, and how the state, how the relation with those structure and the state. I remember that it was impossible for us to speak to any civil servant, to speak to any UN representative, to speak to any NGO, because we weren't a structure, because we didn't have leadership, because we didn't have, we weren't organized, and we were not part of this market of NGO. And today it's becoming a trend across at least DRC and across in some countries in the continent to divert from those traditional organizations called civil society to more and more grassroots organized movements to push for accountability. And there is so many challenges that goes from that. I think I may come back to this. But I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is how we define this civil society, and is this ONGisation, as we say in French, and marketization of civil society the solution, or how we should go from leave the market of civil society to bring it back to the grassroots civil society, and probably capacitating the people so that they can speak by themselves and hold the rules accountable.
Thank you, Fred, for a very forceful demonstration, an example of how a new generation of civil society activists has tried to tap into the grassroots to make political change happen. We haven't heard yet from the two other speakers on their perception of the role of civil society. We've heard two very different visions between the idea of a civilocracy of experts funded by donor countries who somehow crowd out grassroots movements, the poor and educated rural populations, and a more grassroots vision of what a movement should be, and how civil society can try and hold the powerful accountable. What's your vision from your experiences in your respective countries? Maybe Mr. Conde first from Guinea to hear a different perspective from a different region.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que, à écouter les deux premiers intervenants à ma droite, on comprend aisément que les défis de l'aspect civil au niveau de notre région Afrique, c'est à peu près les mêmes questions. Mais le questionnement doit aller où? C'est la question de professionnalisation des organisations de la société civile. Quand je prends le contexte guinéen, surtout au niveau de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, vous comprendrez que la plupart de nos organisations, au début, travaillent, comme c'est dit, une société civile forte, une force de proposition, de veille et d'interpellation. Mais lorsque la plupart de ces organisations commencent à travailler dans la veille, c'est tout de suite nos gouvernants qui les approchent. Donc si ce n'est pas une organisation de la société civile qui est assez professionnelle, qui est en mesure de pouvoir... Donc, si ce n'est pas une organisation qui est assez professionnelle et qui a de la matière à vendre, tout de suite, il est obligé d'être, au lieu d'être là pour contrôler le marché et demander des comptes au gouvernement, il devient tout de suite elle-même produit du marché. C'est pourquoi vous comprendrez que la plupart de nos leaders au niveau de la société civile sont parfois récupérés par les structures étatiques, bombardés à des postes de ministres, à des postes de directeurs généraux, et ainsi de suite. Et dès que ça s'est fait, ils sont obligés maintenant de fermer la bouche. En l'an 2010, après le décès de notre président, le fait général Lansana Conté, des militaires ont pris le pouvoir et on a eu des soupçons sur la possibilité de vouloir favoriser un candidat aux élections. Nous avons demandé une participation de la société civile à l'organe de transition que les partis politiques même ne voulaient pas. Donc on s'est battu et finalement, on s'est retrouvé dans l'organe de transition au niveau du CNT où on devait légiférer les lois. On a mis en place, dans le processus électoral, un système de comptage parallèle du vote. Mais qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? On a été appuyé par des partenaires, notamment le NDI et d'autres structures. Et lorsque nous avons fait le comptage parallèle des votes, au premier tour, nous avons un opposant qui a eu 43% du suffrage valablement exprimé, contre l'actuel président Alpha Conde qui a eu 18%. Et lorsque la CENI s'est apprêtée à proclamer les résultats, à minuit, nous avons reçu la visite de la garde présidentielle composée des bérets rouges, des gendarmes et de la police pour venir récupérer tout le matériel de travail, les ordinateurs, les tablettes, ainsi de suite. Mais ils avaient oublié que nous, on faisait le système de comptage parallèle online. Donc déjà, on avait toutes nos données qui étaient stockées déjà en ligne. Donc la destruction de ce système ne permettait pas de perdre. Donc, ils ont passé 3 jours pour s'assurer qu'effectivement les données qu'on avait ne pouvaient plus être utilisées. Ils ont prévu la proclamation des résultats qui donnait automatiquement gagnant le candidat Alpha Condé qui avait 18%, contre l'autre candidat qui avait 43%. Mais comme ils n'ont pas pu, ils ont proclamé les résultats tels que c'était présenté. L'opposant, 43%, Alpha Condé, 18%. Et comme notre loi dit qu'il faut avoir 50,1% pour être élu, donc il fallait aller à un deuxième tour. Et c'est le seul pays au monde où pour le moment il y a eu 4 mois entre 2 tours des élections. C'est-à-dire que le premier tour, après le premier tour des élections, le gouvernement a mis 4 mois pour aller au deuxième tour, pour les permettre de s'assurer que le candidat Alpha Condé pouvait valablement remporter les élections. Donc on a continué le même travail. À la veille des élections, nous on a été interpellés pour dire qu'il n'y a aucune loi en Guinée qui permet à la société civile de faire le comptage parallèle du vote. Donc tous ceux qui étaient leaders de notre mouvement, que ce soit au niveau de la capitale et à l'intérieur du pays, ont été interpellés. Et ce n'est que 72 heures après le scrutin qu'on a été libre de nos mouvements. Et c'est ainsi qu'ils ont déclaré le candidat Alpha Condé vainqueur des élections. Le pays a connu beaucoup de violences. Et après, dans le cadre du suivi, parce que nous avons mis en place un dispositif qu'on a appelé l'AGIL. L'AGIL, c'est une langue locale, ça veut dire je tiens ma promesse. Donc, nous avons créé une base de données qui recensait l'ensemble des promesses de campagne du candidat Alpha Condé. D'abord, c'était l'éradication de la poliomyélite, parce que notre pays à l'époque était devenu l'épicentre de la poliomyélite pour tout le monde entier. Et on s'est dit qu'il faut quitter dans la dénonciation pour aller faire des propositions concrètes au gouvernement. Donc, on a travaillé avec la commission santé de l'Assemblée, qui nous a donné à peu près une copie de la loi des finances pour l'année 2013, qui devait être utilisée au niveau de la santé. On s'est rendu compte que l'arme que les pouvoirs publics ont, c'est l'argent public, pour acheter les organisations de la société civile et les mettre de leur côté et les fermer. Et plus on avançait, plus on se rendait compte que la plupart des organisations qui étaient dans nos mouvements essayaient de se taire au fur et à mesure qu'on avançait. Aujourd'hui, vous rencontrez un leader, vous avez une réunion demain, il te dit « Ah bon, écoute, moi j'ai reçu de la pression de la famille, je ne peux plus faire ça, je ne peux plus faire ça. » Donc, nous avons fait des missions avec les parlementaires dans toutes les régions du pays pour voir est-ce que ce qui est prévu au niveau de la commission santé de l'Assemblée nationale comme budget affecté au ministère de la Santé, est-ce que c'est réalisé? On s'est rendu compte que plus de 75% de ce budget revenait encore dans les postes des politiques au niveau de la capitale. Et les investissements n'étaient pas réalisés. Donc, on a déjà eu une arme pour convaincre les citoyens à sanctionner le régime dans les urnes. Par exemple, une région comme la région de Kankan, qui fait frontière au Mali et à la Côte d'Ivoire, où il était prévu d'investir plus de 4 millions de dollars pour la réalisation des centres de santé communautaires, vous remarquerez que 0 francs ont été investis dans cette région. Donc, on a été avec des statistiques pour expliquer à la population en quoi, cette fois-ci, il faut refuser d'accorder ces voix au régime en place pour ne pas continuer pour ne pas que les femmes continuent, par exemple, à mourir par suite d'accouchement ou pour ne pas que des enfants continuent à mourir parce qu'ils n'ont pas eu les vaccins. Donc, on est allé aux élections législatives. Le pouvoir en place, le président Alpha Condé a perdu les 5 communes de la capitale Conakry, il n'a eu aucun député. C'était une première fois depuis l'histoire du pays qu'un président en exercice de fonction perd les élections législatives au niveau des 5 communes de la capitale. On a continué les discussions. En 2015, malheureusement, il a eu le soutien de beaucoup de ses pairs de la sous-région, notamment le président du Mali. Ils ont organisé les élections qu'eux-mêmes ils ont gérées, parce que je ne peux pas appeler ça élection. Une élection où c'est eux-mêmes qui ont tout géré. Au niveau de la commission électorale, il n'y avait pas de plénière entre les représentants de l'opposition, de la société civile et du parti au pouvoir. Et le comptage des voix, vous allez remarquer que devant un bureau de vote, c'est affiché là, 500 votants, Alpha Condé, 22. Les partis de l'opposition ont plus de 100 et quelques. Mais vous remarquerez qu'à la centralisation, c'est un autre résultat qui vient, qui n'a rien à voir avec ce bureau de vote. Donc, il s'est fait élire en 2015. On s'est dit, bon, comme nous avons une constitution qui limite les mandats à 2, donc en 2020, il va partir. Mais aujourd'hui...
Monsieur Conde, merci beaucoup pour cette analyse très fine des élections et différentes étapes. I think the general point you've made very persuasively is you've raised the risk that civil society can be bought off or co-opted by power, but you've also shown the very important role that civil society played in your own country in holding the state accountable and also doing something very important which has become very common on the continent, which is parallel voter tabulation, how civil society groups do parallel voter tabulation, and this, I think, creates a powerful check on the capacity of election commissions or governments to rig the results, and that's often the role of civil society, thanks to a methodology which I think was pioneered by NDI. So I think you recognize both the risks that some people have raised with NGOs, but also you've shown the power they can exert on politics through their role of checking and keeping government institutions accountable. And maybe I'd like to now give the floor to Mr. Heywood, who's also tried to do this, I believe, and push the needle and hold maybe state services in health, education accountable and push them in a progressive direction. Perhaps, Mr. Heywood, you can reflect on some of the comments made so far.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much. I think I want to start by going back to what Brian said and has been echoed in various ways by other colleagues. And I think Brian is right. He identifies fault lines, he identifies design flaws in civil society. He points out the way in which civil society has been co-opted in certain ways, how its professionalization has built a social distance between activism and the people who are meant to be the beneficiaries of activism. But I think what perhaps Brian didn't get to is that that doesn't take away the potential and power that resides within civil society. Now, I'm of the view that civil society is the future of our planet, not just of our countries, but of our planet. I was reading a book on the plane on the way down here today, put together by people involved in the Extinction Rebellion. I don't think we're going to get the political and economic movement that we need around the climate crisis, for example, if people are not organized. I also think, and I throw this out as a challenge to people in this room, my personal view is that politics and political parties are irredeemably corrupted, incapable of deep transformative change almost anywhere in the world today. We can't do away with them yet, but they have to be complemented and guided and driven by independent civic activism. And I think if you accept that, then it means we're talking about a very different era of governance and government to the era of governance and governance that most of us grew up in the late 20th century. Things have changed so fundamentally, and we have to understand how those changes are. So I think we must be very careful not to overlook the heterogeneity of civil society. You know, we talk about civil society, and you see it in academic literature, these two words, civil society. But very few people bury down to see what is this creature? What is its many heads? How does it operate? What's the difference between a fees must fall, a social movement, and a professional NGO that's working in law? And I think that there are roles for both. I've built a movement. I've built a social movement, the Treatment Action Campaign. It's still going. It's 20 years. It's still got 10,000 volunteers. But a social movement, I can tell you, I've studied it like a business. It has its rise. It has its dips. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you're able to steer it back to another rise. But social movements are incredibly complex things, and they're very, very difficult to keep together over a long period of time. Having said that, I agree completely with what Brian said about this question of leadership succession. So I just want to finish with a couple of other points, is that I think the challenge for people in the NGO side of civil society is to be very careful not to appropriate voice or power of mass movements. And that's what we often do. Particularly when you get to be something like me, you become part of the elite, you're a director of a respected NGO, you suddenly find yourself in the top 5% of income earners in a country, even if you're earning nothing like what government earns or what the private sector earns, you've placed yourself in an elite. and you become risk averse. And by becoming risk averse, you can then become a brake on the type of deep, radical, transformative progress. So this critique is very necessary. And I just want to finish, though, by 2 points. One is to say, again, that this idea of civil society is a relatively new notion. You know, you can trace the word back centuries, but the role that has been assigned to civil society in modern politics really dates to the middle of the 1980s, and in particular the Vienna Declaration. That's where you start to see that term being used increasingly. Civil society drove the democratic wave that changed our societies in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s, in different ways and in different places. The tragedy now is that civil society is becoming the first victim of the democratic recession. And I'll finish on this point. I've just done some research looking at what the UN calls closing civic space in all the countries of SADC, except for Tanzania and the DRC, and we know what's going on in both of those countries. But in every single country, there is a backward slide on basic democratic principles of freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, etc., etc., etc. And I think what we have got to understand is that the price of a clampdown on civil society is a societal price. It's not just the cost of us who end up in prison or our NGOs get closed down. There's a societal cost to be paid by allowing these type of attacks on civil society.
Gosh, Mark, thank you very much for a very interesting contribution, which I think takes note of the critique, powerful critique of Brian at the beginning, but also shows the potential of civil society. It shows also the diversity of what we put under the rubric of civil society, and showed that there are waves and always new movements coming up and the role they can play. Now, I believe it was Mr. Conde on my right who talked about the importance of Guinea's neighbors in the outcome of the election there, and I think that he's not alone in Guinea. In the region too, we've seen how neighbors' policies have had an impact on electoral outcomes and generally the trend of democracy in the region. And so I know that Fred has been trying to organize a kind of Pan-African civil society movement where they would echo in some ways what the frontline states did during the liberation struggle, but for NGOs to support each other across borders and also exercise regional influence, but on a civil society level. And that's why I was interested in maybe hearing from Bonolo, who is trying to also get civil society to work together across Africa through the Pan-African Parliament, and what potential do you see in civil society working together across borders?
So I just want to say that particularly in a reflection of the Pan-African Parliament as an organ of the AU, just to give context and see where the avenue for collaborations could be located. That the establishment of the Pan-African Parliament as it is, that it signaled such a historical milestone. So the AU had an organization called ECOSOC that was meant to be an organ that is a representative of civil society in Africa. And then the ECOSOC failed to open up space, and it still does fail to open up space for civil society to engage effectively and perhaps even explore formal mechanism of engagement with this organ. And so the establishment of the Pan-African Parliament comes as a good alternative in the sense that it will ensure that there's full participation of Africans in development, in economic integration in Africa, in issues around good governance, in issues around democracy, human rights, rule of law, peace and security, integration and development, and so on and so forth. And so the Pan-African Parliament as an institution of the African Union, it's not very restricted in how it can open doors for civil society to engage with it. I think you would know that it doesn't have, the PAP does not have legislative rights. but it has a few roles that it plays, like observer right, budgetary right, and so on and so forth. So there is a potential to create collaborations with civil society engagement, because as an institution, it's not completely limited by the AU. If you think about the Commission, the AU currently is threatening the autonomy of the African Commission in a sense that it bullies the AU on which organization should have observer right? So there's a number of organizations that have observer right at the African Commission, but yet the African Union still threatens the autonomy of the Commission on who should have the observer right and who shouldn't have the observer right. And that is not the case for the Pan-African Parliament, and it then opens up a space for civil society to speak on matters that are a challenge in Africa, and speak on those very bravely in terms of how do we keep our states accountable? How do we ensure that we combat corruption? How do we ensure that there's good governance in in Africa? And so the space is almost unrestricted, and the PAP has complete autonomy in engaging with civil society in that sense. So on a more practical level, there are opportunities for civil society within the region to offer technical support to the Pan-African Parliament. So the Pan-African Parliament has about 11 committees that vary from finance to trade and investment to justice and human rights, that vary to rights of persons with disability, and so on and so forth. So there is a space to gather civil society within the region with various technical skills, with various experiences that they have, to capacitate members of the Pan-African Parliament to go back to their countries and actually do governance and do leadership better. And
so you basically are trying to work with an existing institution, which is the Pan-African Parliament, and use that as an instrument for change in this progressive direction. I just pass the floor to Fred, who's trying to do something similar, but without going through, I think, established political institutions, but actually trying to work with networks of civil society, grassroots organizations across the continent. And what motivated you to do this, and what potential do you think that this kind of cross-border mobilization can have?
Maybe before talking about that, let me explain a little bit how we come out with this idea of bringing together movements, social movements across the continent. If you see the trend in democratization and the problem that many of our countries face currently, you realize very quickly that it's the same kind of problem. If we take two countries in this room, for example, Zimbabwe and DRC, and how the similarity between the rigging elections and the result after, and the reaction of the African Union and all these regional and international institutions, we realize quickly that we are facing similar kind of problem, and therefore there is a need to come together and probably learn from each other on how what works here and what didn't work on the other side, and how we can all together or separately put pressure on our government and Pan-African institutions so that we can have more influence on the system, and also how we can rethink our nation in the way that probably our founding fathers thought at the beginning, and which they quickly divert from. So then came the idea of putting together movements that in some of our countries were very successful in mobilizing for democracy and preventing their president to change, either to change the constitution or to remain in power beyond their terms, and we don't really. I think the common sense in Africa, for example, which is this group, is we don't really believe, and we have reason for that. We don't really believe in African Union, which appear to us as a sort of syndicat de chef d'État, to put it that way. We don't really also believe in SADC for obvious reason. Because more and more, and I liked what someone mentioned yesterday, that we need to reclaim the SADC. We need to reclaim our role in this organization. But to do so, we need to come together as a force. And as civil society, we don't have money, we don't have guns, we don't have all the state force. We have our numbers, and we have our possibility to constrain our leaders. And if we do it all together, probably we will be more effective in reclaiming our place in this political atmosphere or civil society space. So the idea really of Afriki and this union of social movements across the continent is to try to learn from one another and to try to help those younger movements that are daily pop up in different African countries, so that this Pan-African grassroots movement can emerge again and be able to drive some change from a grassroots level to from bottom up.
Thanks, Fred. I hesitate to turn to our ruling civilocrat on the far side there, Brian. What do you think about these initiatives to try to work across the continent, either through formal institutions like the Pan-African Parliament or through grassroots movements like Fred's Afriki? How credible do you think these movements are, and do you have any suggestions of your own?
First, let me celebrate this generation as the greatest generation of activists ever. And I'm sure that Mark will agree, we've not had such great activists. Having said that, let me also then decry that they are all infected with political amnesia. Let me explain, because if you insult anyone in public, you must explain. I was part of a generation of people, some of them I see them in this room, who were involved in setting up regional civil society forum, what became the SADC, CNGOs, the XF. I was also part of the support. I worked with a group called Action Aid International and others, supporting continental thematic movements that were working on health and HIV and AIDS, that were working on so on and so forth. Right? And Mark, you can talk more authoritatively about the continental thematics than I am. So, and Brian Raftopoulos in this room and other academics I saw were involved in the APS Forum, the African Association of Political Science, and then CODESRIA. And then I was a co-convener with the late Sam Moyo and some comrades here, some who are now vice chancellors, of the Africa, Asia, Latin America Social Movements Dialogue. And or platform. So we would go and spend time. I think I spent one time 3 weeks on the campus of MST, which is the largest landless people's movement in Brazil. And we were part of the effort that brought La Via Campesina into Mozambique and portions of West Africa. And then there was a Soweto Electricity Committee, Anti-Privatization Forum here in South Africa, Abahlali baseMjondolo, and there were many of these platforms. So this has been done before. And the interesting thing, though, is your effort. I forgot to say. So I was the first convener of what is called CCPAU, Center for Citizen Participation in the African Union. So those of you who attend African Union jamborees, we used to have those citizen conferences. I think we did up to 9 or 10 citizen conferences, bring citizens, NGOs from all over, and then I stepped down from the board. Why am I telling you this? Because we opened the engagement with Pan-African Parliament, the African Union, and we had our fights because some of us had been part of the ECOSOC pre-inception moment. I'm raising these things because what you are doing is commendable, but it will suffer from the same leprosy unless there is an intergenerational dialogue. You talk to the ones that have done this before. Because what happens, because I work with a funding agency sometimes, is that donors tend to, in order to fulfill the need of a moment, to pour money. The dehistoricization will falsely suggest to you that this is it's a different moment. No, that's a lie, because what has happened is the things that Mark and Co were contesting may take a different manifestation, but it's still the same structures, pharmaceuticals, governments failing to. So there are continuities of struggle. And what has tended to happen because of poor documentation, poor intergenerational dialogue, the frustration of closure, the professionalization, the things we talked about, is we decapitate our own potential. So you are greater than any generation I've known of civil society activists, because you've come into this moment conscious that to win the struggles, you have to fight a transnational, global struggle right from the onset. But don't forget, there were young people before you who did from Genoa to Washington, fighting neoliberalism and so on and so forth. And as Mark rightly said, that I think the intention, the difference between civil society as a professional idea and civil society as a movement of people affected by something is that there's no intention when you suffer from any structural problem to become permanent, right? It's a struggle, as we used to say in labor, it's a rolling type of actions. You encounter any manifestations of power as it comes. So I would say, Chair, what they're doing is absolutely necessary, not for what they think they will achieve, because they won't achieve what they think they will achieve. It's absolutely necessary for building a new generation of leadership and agency and consciousness. So when I spoke earlier, I left out two words: consciousness and solidarity. One of the things we learned from movements before our own, and those of you in the anti-apartheid movement will know this, that solidarity is that act that self-identifies with the commonality of the structures of oppression and the universality of the appetite for freedom, for justice, for so on and so forth. And the idea that people sitting in Zimbabwe can pronounce themselves on what is going on in Malawi as though they were affected. People not in limited nationalistic and individual terms, but in this Pan-Africanist way is important. So solidarity, but consciousness. What has tended to happen in this generation is, I think, an infectious narcissism, because activism has come with Twitter or social media followers and so on and so forth. There's a messianic leadership mindset that has emerged, not even imposed by the state, but by followers on Twitter. So what it has tended to do is anybody can become a hero without investing in understanding the political economy of what they are fighting, without deepening the consciousness of their constituents. Moral outrage and anger are not strategies. They are in and of themselves not sustaining. So you need to move to, you need them in order to fight a struggle, but you need consciousness in order to sustain a struggle. Because every struggle you fight will have ups and downs, because the other side is not folding its hands, waiting for you to punch and to get your gains. They fight back. And the other side sometimes is a shadowy set of interests, visible, non-visible, formal and informal. So this generation needs to be celebrated because they are the greatest group of activists, but they need to be encouraged that deepen the levels of consciousness beyond likes and retweets. Deepen the levels of consciousness beyond, my generation got detained, and Mark rightly said, movement celebrities, movement gigolos, suddenly the Americans and the British and the Swiss, everybody was giving you, I don't know how many leadership programs I went for the Americans. I saw somebody listed the World Economic Forum Young Global. You become like a monkey in a cage, paraded for freedom credentials or struggle credentials. What then is chowed away is not just the disconnect. It is remembering what that politics is. Wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt does not make you a revolutionary. Quoting Frantz Fanon does not make you a revolutionary. I think what needs to happen is there is a battle for narrative and for ideas. And it's much more than holding governments to account. It's how do we transform society, transform power. This generation too has become more patriarchal than the one before it. Some of the femicide, some of the things we see, is because of a lack of consciousness. So whilst I celebrate this generation, my only plea is simple. Are you the ones, or should we expect another? If you are the ones, then deepen your consciousness and boldly march on. What we experienced, that was simply, if you like, before you start an exam, they give you those instructions, concentrate. You are in the real struggle. It's more real because whilst liberalism, according to Raftopoulos and others, seems to have failed, the ideas of liberalism, so the neoliberal project failed in terms of neoliberal economics with the collapse of 2008. But the ideas of minimalist state, the ideas of civil society borrowed from neoliberalism, the ideas of the relationship have become more dominant than the failure of. So it is important that you don't become model missionaries and model mercenaries of a failed neoliberal project.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think that you've made very forceful points. I want to turn to Mark, because you've also been around the block a few times, and we have here Brian saying that basically there's amnesia, political amnesia, and we've seen it all before, and I'm wondering whether you see major changes in the political environment in the SADC region between maybe your generation and the new generation that Manolo and Fred embody, with, for example, it's been mentioned here, the advent of social media, the internet, which are new tools of mobilization, facilitating communication across borders. What's your take on that?
Look, again, I agree with, I think, 95% of what's been said. We are in a new era, and there are new challenges. I mean, social media can... 10, 15 years ago, we in civil society were all heralding social media as something that we could harness, that was going to empower civil society, going to empower transformation. Now we see that social media is actually working against transformation, and the Twitter and the Facebook and the ability of the Cambridge Analyticas, etc., to manipulate, subtly insinuate public opinion. And that is why, again, I agree with Brian that you need a bulwark against that. And that can only be a political consciousness. And I think that what this generation, not everybody, and let me be careful what I say, but there's a danger that the kind of generation of the last 15 or 20 years has lost a sense of history, has lost a sense of politics, how we have got to where we have got to in the world today. You know, we were lucky. I don't know fully Brian's background, but you know, I grew up in something called the Marxist workers' tendency of the ANC in the exile years, but at least it forced me to study politics, economics, history. It grounded my practice as an activist in societal understanding. Now, a lot of the kind of Marxism may have been proved to be wrong at the end of the day, and I think we need to be looking for post-socialism as much as we're looking for post-capitalism. But the method, etc., was critically important. And it's that we have to, I think, try to reinstill. And let me make this point, because I probably won't get another chance to speak, and because we're in a university environment, because I think one of the questions we have to ask of universities and of academics and researchers is, when is your attitude to civil society going to change? You have business schools, you have schools of governance, etc., etc. You accept that politicians play a role, you accept that business plays a role, but you give a very thin lip service to civil society. I think that you need to understand that civil society is a complex organizational form. It is not an amateur poor relation of business or governance, something that just fills some of the cracks. So when are you going to start meaningfully studying civil society with a view to giving civil society power? But when you do that, how can you do that in a way that doesn't blunt civil society? How can you empower community activists, NGOs, but not co-opt them. That I think is going to be one of the critical challenges. And that, again, is about how you import history and ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And this last point, very, very last point, because again, it's something I agree with. If there's a big criticism I make of civil society at the moment is that we are reactive and defensive. And we're going to have to start to become proactive. We need a galvanizing vision of the society that we want. We can't win battles just as defensive battles. You know, Naomi Klein wrote this book, it's called No Is Not Enough. And I think that's right. No is not enough. We have to galvanize societies with practical, concrete, evidence-based, researched plans of alternative ways of running fairer, more democratic, more equal countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm going to take the liberty of going a little bit over time since we began 15 minutes late. I'm going to give for 20 minutes for questions, and I know many, not questions, I think comments also. And we've got Brian Rafstopoulos with his hand up for the last 10 minutes, so go ahead, Brian.
Thank you. Just to say thank you for a really stimulating discussion. I want to comment mainly on the stuff that Brian and Mark have talked about. First, just to correct Brian, I never said liberalism has failed. No. I said there's a crisis of global liberalism. There's a difference between that. The critique that Brian has made draws on a very strong academic literature which associates or discusses the subsumption of rights under neoliberalism in the 90s. There's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a problem. Because one, it assumes that the rights debate, it doesn't look at the historical rights debate, which precedes neoliberalism. That rights, for example, were part of the liberation movement discourse, human rights, civic rights. And therefore, this assumption that it only becomes a feature of neoliberalism is historically incorrect. And that's the importance of looking at the history of rights. And the importance of looking at the heterogeneity of civil society. That it can use the rights debate to open up issues, as it has done in all our societies. It's been very important in opening up a space in our societies. And we have to be careful in associating rights with neoliberalism, because that is exactly what authoritarian states have done, like Zimbabwe. They've drawn a rupture between the rights debate, which they see as a foreign intervention, and the redistribution debate, which they see as indigenous. They don't see the connection between the two. And in the history of the left, there's a long debate about rights and changing production relations. We know the 20th century was very rich in the debates about what a democratic socialism should be about. That's where the rights debate issue was also placed there. And so the continuities are as important as the changes and the ruptures. And I think historically that's important, and the speakers, I think, have pointed that out. Even the new movements, the hashtag movements, their discourse draws on the debates of the previous civic movements. In Zimbabwe, the demands of the hashtag movements were very much on the plate of, for example, the constitutional movement. That there's a continuity. As much as there's changes, there's also a continuity. And those continuities are important to discuss. So just to say that I think the rights debate is a very important debate. It's not just a neoliberal manifestation. It precedes the neoliberalism. And therefore, those groups that are fighting on the basis of rights, they need to suture the new connections between redistributive issues and the rights debate, and do it, as Mark has said, in new articulations, which establish a new imaginary of change, which goes beyond where we are now. And for that, we have a lot to learn from the struggles of the past. And the sense of history is very important in this moment, where information is gathered from little blogs and little tweets, but not long studies of historical processes, which are really, really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian, for a very interesting comment. Maybe Reverend Tata.
Thank you very much for the discussion. What I did not hear from this conversation, if you are talking about civil society, is that space between the state and private sector and other non-state actors. I thought I would hear something about the church. Not because I come from the church myself, but because maybe to broaden it, maybe religion also in some countries where in Africa where the Christian church is the dominant platform. Because I think this is one civil society space which is far much older than the other civil society organizations you are talking about. But also, I think as one space where you have a regularity of engagement. Weekly, people who volunteer in their millions in Africa, in Central and Southern Africa, to come and sit before religious leadership. I'm not saying that this leadership is always constructive or is this helpful, but I thought it would be helpful to understand how civil society could tap into this ready-made space. I say this because in some places where civil society space become completely closed, the only space that is open is the religious space. And I thought I could get some comment from your panelists.
I'll take one last question from Jean-Claude, who's had his hand up for a while, and then maybe let some of the people address the points made. Jean-Claude, s'il te plaît. I'll come back to Mrs. Bezaiba afterwards. Jean-Claude.
Merci, Sébastien. La première question, je la pose à Madame qui a parlé du Parlement panafricain comme étant un lieu où la collaboration peut être efficace entre la société civile. Elle a bien fait de reconnaître que le Parlement ne dispose d'aucun pouvoir, mais il y a un autre élément qui pour moi est plus important. Ce Parlement panafricain est l'émanation de nos parlements nationaux. Ce sont ces députés de pouvoir corrompus au niveau national qui sont envoyés au Parlement africain. Comment pourrons-nous collaborer avec les mêmes personnes qui, au niveau national, ne nous apportent rien, bien au contraire? Et donc, il y a quelque part là une ambiguïté, et je voudrais avoir son avis là-dessus. Ensuite, je remercie l'ensemble des intervenants, mais il y a pour moi trois problèmes que j'appellerais trois dualités dans les rôles de la société civile. Société civile, force de contestation, c'est reconnu. On est admiré pour ça. Mais ces dernières années, quand je vois ce qui se passe en RDC et par ailleurs dans l'Afrique, je me trouve qu'en tant que force de contestation, la société civile a atteint ses limites. Alors, doit-elle rester une force de contestation ou doit-elle, au-delà d'accompagner les acteurs étatiques ou de proposer des choses, peut-être que le message doit être celui d'apporter une offre nouvelle à la population, donner de l'espoir à la population plutôt que de continuer à contester. Parce que moi qui collabore avec ces nouveaux mouvements, ces jeunes, je leur dis souvent, vous savez, vous avez une limite. Quand vous contestez, vous êtes soutenu, vous êtes applaudi, tout le monde dit oui, vous êtes magnifique. Mais il y a un problème. Les mouvements sociaux aujourd'hui, ces jeunes qui s'engagent, qui réussissent, commencent à atteindre leurs limites. Parce qu'au-delà de leur réussite en protestant, les changements attendus n'arrivent pratiquement pas. Parce que la population dans son ensemble, dans sa majorité, n'y adhère pas. J'ai entendu des jeunes pour me dire, mais on est sous pression par nos familles. Si nos propres familles ne comprennent pas le sens de notre engagement, nous disent d'arrêter, parce que vous allez vous faire tuer, c'est qu'il y a un problème quelque part. Parce que les gens, la population dans son ensemble, n'arrivent pas à adhérer à un message, à un mouvement, à une action qui est fait pour leur cause. Ça, c'est le premier élément. Dualité, proposition, contestation. Je vais aller vite. La deuxième chose, et pour moi, c'est sans doute la question la plus importante, la question du financement. Fin de l'année dernière, on a été reçu par le président de la fondation Tabombeki, qui nous a fait un savon. Vous, les jeunes, vous êtes soutenus par les Occidentaux, vous êtes financés par les Occidentaux, vous venez protester en Afrique, attaquer nos gouvernements, ça ne va pas, vous êtes des instruments de l'impérialiste. Alors, je l'ai regardé, je lui ai dit, dites-moi, vous, leaders panafricains, combien d'entre vous soutiennent, financent, accompagnent les jeunes qui s'engagent pour le changement dans leur pays? Si vous ne les accompagnez pas, ces jeunes qui sont sans moyens, qui après leurs études universitaires se retrouvent au chômage, n'ont pas de travail, qui aiment leur pays, ont besoin de faire vivre leur idéal. Comment pourront-ils refuser ce qui arrive pour les appuyer, pour les accompagner? Que faites-vous? Combien de milliardaires africains ont des fondations qui financent les mouvements citoyens en Afrique? Combien des États africains, même ceux démocratiques, leurs présidents soutiennent et accompagnent les mouvements des jeunes à travers le continent? Nada. Alors
merci Jean-Claude.
Plutôt que de continuer, essayons peut-être de changer notre façon et d'accompagner ces jeunes. Merci.
Merci Jean-Claude. So I think we've had a few statements and then a couple of questions. The questions that I took note of was the role of churches, and that's been absent in our debate. Do one of you want to reflect on the role of churches and how, if and how, your brand of civil society connects with churches in your respective countries? I know it's a big issue in the DRC, but maybe Fred, but others can also free to chime in. Maybe Fred, I know the church has played a key role in democratizing the DRC. What do you think?
Well, let me speak in French for a moment. Je pense que l'Église a joué un rôle clé dans le processus de démocratisation. Mais il faut mettre l'Église dans une même case, c'est se tromper. L'Église est diverse aussi. Et même si l'Église catholique et certaines églises protestantes ont joué un certain rôle, un rôle important pendant tout le cours, pas seulement la démocratisation, mais depuis l'indépendance jusqu'à aujourd'hui, les églises ont également, à un moment donné, et continuent d'ailleurs, à jouer un rôle pas si négatif pour certaines. Et on voit si bien au Congo que de la même manière que l'Église catholique, par exemple, a intervenu dans l'observation des élections, dans la tabulation parallèle, a intervenu dans l'éducation civique, etc., etc. Il y a d'autres églises, parmi probablement des petites églises, mais des églises qui drainent beaucoup de foules, qui participent activement dans cette processus d'empêcher la population à pouvoir exprimer vivement ses opinions. L'Église qui embrasse plus ou moins constamment, d'ailleurs, les opinions du régime en place, parce que l'Église, d'une certaine manière, une certaine catégorie d'Église se retrouve complètement dans ce système-là. Et donc, au lieu de réveiller la population, au lieu d'éduquer la population, elles endorment la population. Parfois, elles appellent des églises de réveil. Mais peut-être, juste avant de passer la parole, j'aimerais revenir sur le commentaire de mon aîné ici, sur le rôle du mouvement citoyen, l'absence d'une perspective historique des luttes, l'absence d'une certaine conscience. Et je pense, même si vous m'avez dit, to quote Fanon is not the symbol of activism and so on, mais je pense que Fanon avait raison lorsqu'il parlait de lutte, que chaque génération a ses challenges, et chaque génération, en faisant face à ces challenges, il le fait dans ses limites. Et nous ne sommes pas la dernière génération, nous ne sommes pas la plus grande génération d'activisme. Nous sommes juste une génération qui essaye de faire face à nos challenges actuels avec des moyens limités, dans un environnement limité. Et nous essayons d'apprendre du passé. Nous essayons de parler avec nos aînés. Certains sont dans cette salle, ils savent qu'on les consulte assez souvent pour savoir comment est-ce qu'ils avaient fait dans le passé. L'honorable Bahati ou Marie-Madeleine ont été la société civile des années 90. Il y a eu des gens qui ont participé dans le combat pour les indépendances, et nous acceptons cela, nous reconnaissons cela. Nous reconnaissons que notre lutte aujourd'hui est une succession de luttes passées. La vôtre était, et elle continue, il y a une succession de combats, mais c'est différents challenges, c'est différents défis, c'est différentes forces auxquelles on s'oppose. Et ça, ce n'est pas... Non, il faut que je le précise quand même. Ce n'est pas nouveau. C'est ancien, ça date probablement une décennie, depuis que le Marcus Garvey et les autres se réunissaient, les rencontres panafricaines et tout, ça ne date pas d'une dizaine d'années. Mais pour chaque génération, dans ses limites, je pense, moi je n'espère pas être le dernier activiste, ni le plus grand d'ailleurs, je ne le suis pas. Mais j'espère que pour ma génération, nous essayerons de contribuer le minimum possible pour avancer la conception de notre lutte circonscrite dans un univers temporel et spatial défini pour que la prochaine génération reprenne les relais et nous critique. Évidemment, je ne m'attends pas à ce que quand j'aurai 50 ans, les gens disent qu'il a été le plus grand leader. Ils nous diront probablement qu'on a échoué et qu'on n'a pas fait ce qu'il fallait, mais au moins, j'aurais l'impression qu'en ce moment-là, avec des moyens limités, j'ai essayé de faire ce que je pouvais. Et les collègues avec moi.
Which I think has to be addressed is the question to you, Bonolo, about the weakness of African parliaments and therefore what you can possibly achieve with and through them, which I think you have to address.
Can I just make a comment on what the Reverend has said before I answer the question? President Thabo Mbeki once said that in the past, the church has produced many outstanding leaders. And should the church stop playing this role, then our future will look poorer. And I think particularly in South Africa, we see a very strong presence of the church. If you think around movements like Fees Must Fall, the church took a really active role in caring for the students and being in the front line of those protests. So it is an important institution, it is an important organ in society that we actually should be intentional about bringing it in these spaces. But to answer the question on the Pan-African Parliament, I'm sorry, I'm gonna try and pronounce your name nicely. No, Zigamai shared a story yesterday about the Wailing Wall, and said the old man kept going back daily, and eventually felt like he was pushing the wall. And so there is a recognition that there's corruption in Africa, that's the reality. There is very poor leadership. There's an incredible lack of leadership in Africa. There's inequality, there's unemployment, there's poverty, there's continued contravention of human rights. But it doesn't mean that we should sit back and think to ourselves that this is what it is, therefore we can't think of alternative measures to bring change. So I want to think of, I have this alternative imagination of what I want to see Africa look like, as opposed to what Africa looks like at the moment. And because I've got an alternative imagination of what I want to see this continent looks like, even with the current realities of our leaders, and it's not an act of naivety. I acknowledge that it might be a bit ambiguous, and I acknowledge that yes, as a region, we have a problem, right? But we'll continue being active and continue exploring alternative spaces that will bring change. And if it's entering Pan-African Parliament as an institution and an organ of AU, and hoping that there will be pockets of people within those institutions that will want to see the change and the transformation that we want to see in Africa, then we will occupy those spaces.
Thank you, Bonolo. One last question before I have to bring this to a final close. Madame Bezaïba, vous aviez une question. C'est la dernière question, après on va finir la session. Allez-y.
Merci.
Ah oui, ok.
Sorry, it will be in French, maybe you can...
Everyone has... C'est bon, tout le monde a des machines qui traduisent.
Okay. Alors, ce n'était pas une question, j'allais faire un commentaire par rapport à l'histoire, le processus électoral en Guinée. Monsieur Mory, Conde a parlé de quelque chose qui est totalement similaire à ce que nous avons toujours vécu. Les défis de la société civile, être comme force et tampon entre le pouvoir et la société dans son ensemble. La société civile est confrontée à beaucoup de problèmes, nous devons lui trouver une solution. Celle où elle devient, je le dis toujours, civilement politique ou politiquement civile, parce qu'elle ne sait plus qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire. Moi, j'ai participé dans le mouvement citoyen, surtout le mouvement des femmes et des défenseurs des droits humains, où nous avons vu que la politique était tellement corrompue, nous devons pénétrer la politique pour changer les choses. Nous avons appelé ça mouvement social pour le renouveau. Nous avons recruté dans tous les pays la société civile, femmes, jeunes, églises, les hommes d'affaires. Nous avons créé ces mouvements, mais au fil des jours, ces mouvements, par nos leaders, a été transformé en politique, acheté complètement, et nous nous sommes retirés. Ça devient aujourd'hui un parti politique, mouvement social pour le renouveau. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire pour que la société civile reste soft, société civile, force et tampon, et que les politiques aussi travaillent de l'autre côté? Parce que s'il faut mélanger, à un moment donné, on ne sait plus faire la démarcation entre quelqu'un qui est société civile et qui est politique. C'était ça ma préoccupation.
Merci Madame Zaziba, et je pense que ça me permet aussi de revenir, Monsieur Conde, qui voulait dire quelque chose par rapport à cette question du financement étranger versus financement africain.
Je pense que l'un des défis aujourd'hui pour l'organisation de la société civile, quand à écouter notre aîné qui est à ma droite, ça reste la question d'intégrité et d'achèvement du travail de la société civile. Parce que tout à l'heure, le collègue a fait un commentaire en disant que vous ne verrez aucune fondation, aucun philanthrope africain qui soutient les mouvements des activistes. C'est une réalité. Et c'est ce qui fait que nous sommes dans la plupart du temps limités dans ce que nous faisons. Mais une approche que nous avons commencé à développer au pays, par exemple, moi je suis médecin de santé publique. Et on essaie de convaincre pas mal de citoyens, d'activistes à adhérer à notre mouvement. Si je suis médecin de santé publique, à travers le mouvement, j'ai la possibilité de faire une prestation, par exemple, pour une organisation, je reverse les 10% de ce que j'ai eu comme montant de ma prestation au mouvement pour faire fonctionner l'action du mouvement. Parce qu'on s'est rendu compte que, avec tout ce que nous faisons, ça dérange l'État. Et la plupart des partenaires, quand je prends l'USAID, l'Union européenne, ils passent généralement par l'État pour appuyer les initiatives des ONG au pays. Et lorsque toi, tu es reconnu vis-à-vis de l'État comme une organisation qui ne fait pas de cadeaux au président, dans les radios, dans les télévisions, on essaye de faire un verrou sur toi dans le cadre de la recherche de financement. Donc, la possibilité est d'utiliser sa propre personne. Lorsque je postule, par exemple, pour faire une consultation, pour une étude, pour le compte de la GIZ, j'ai $5 000, je reverse automatiquement les 10% de ce montant pour le compte du mouvement, afin de faire fonctionner le mouvement, parce que j'y crois à un idéal. L'idéal, c'est d'amener à faire un changement. Et l'autre chose à côté, c'est de toujours chercher la confiance de la population en ressortant les failles de l'État. Quand je prends aujourd'hui le secteur de l'éducation, pour ceux qui me suivent, par exemple, vous allez partir sur Internet, vous mettez www.moryconde.com, vous allez voir qu'il y a des analyses, par exemple, que j'ai publiées sur l'éducation dans le pays. Ça a permis à une frange de la population de sortir dans les rues, de se révolter contre le gouvernement, parce que ça fait 3 ans successivement que nous avons un taux de réussite au baccalauréat qui est moins de 20%. Mais la cause réelle, c'est la nomination à des postes des militants du parti au pouvoir, à des postes de décision dans l'éducation, et qui fait que les choses ne bougent pas. Donc je pense que la question du financement reste et demeure un grand défi, et qui fait que souvent le discours de certains de nos aînés a tendance à négativer ce que nous faisons. Mais en réalité, nous n'avons pas eu les mêmes opportunités, nous n'avons pas eu les mêmes chances, et je pense que ce paradigme des questions de financement devait changer d'un pays à l'autre. Au Mali, par exemple, nous avons vu avec le président Ibeka, il a interdit à toutes les ONG de pouvoir obtenir un financement auprès des partenaires sans passer par le ministère de l'Intérieur. Nous avons demandé aux collègues maliens des mouvements sociaux de développer des activités génératrices de revenus qui les permettent d'engranger des ressources et eux-mêmes financer leurs propres activités. Aujourd'hui, ça fonctionne au Mali. Tout le monde a vu tout récemment, les élections passées, comment le pouvoir en place, avec tout ce qu'ils ont déboursé comme argent, ils ont perdu une grande partie du pays lors des élections locales. Donc je pense que nous devons changer cette façon de militer aussi au sein de la société civile pour nous-mêmes être en mesure d'utiliser les maigres ressources qu'on peut mobiliser à travers notre expertise et notre compétence.
Merci, Monsieur Conde. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for running a little bit of time. We can bring this to an end. I think that this debate has been very interesting. I think the main thing I've taken away from it is the diversity of civil society and the difficulty of having a meaningful discussion about something which is so incredibly diverse, involving churches, unions, NGOs. I think that also we see a clear distinction between those who want to have revolutionary social movements, I think what Brian Kagoro was talking about, and more reformist NGOs who are working within the existing constraints and trying to make things better. I think there's also key questions raised about how to empower NGOs and allow them to do their work without being co-opted either by governments or by foreign donors. The question also importance of having a historical understanding of what's come before and build on the past rather than each generation thinking it's starting from scratch. Also, I think a key point was the idea that indignation and anger are not enough. They don't constitute a strategy. And so how do you actually strategize? But finally, I think that what I take away from this discussion is that all the CEOs have a number of problems, structural, financial, political, and otherwise. They remain a force and a potential for change, which I think is remarkable. And Mark may be more optimistic than many when he says that CSOs are the future of the planet, but they're definitely a part of the future. And I think with that, I think I invite you all to move to the tea break. Thank you.
I think justice has been done by the panel. In his book, Working with the Grain, Brian Levy talks about islands of effectiveness. And I think from the conversation that we've been listening to, while there are so many challenges affecting civil society, I think a lot has been done, and we need to look at it in the bigger picture. It's like the mystery of rain in a Nigerian proverb, which talks about the mystery of rain that comes in single drops, and yet they only form little streams when they come to each other. And as those little streams flow into each other, only the mighty rivers are formed, and they flow into big oceans that sustain our planet. I want to invite you to give a round of applause to Sebastien and the panel for a job well done.